Jake's voice quivered as he pulled out the silky lingerie and large rubber item from Rachel's suitcase, the shock of the discovery weighing heavily on him. His knuckles turned white as he held the items tightly, his heart thudding in his chest. Rachel, standing in front of the mirror, didn't even glance back. She continued applying her lipstick, the smooth swipe of red across her lips intensifying Jake's anger. She looked at him through the mirror, her eyes uninterested, as if this moment wasn't a major upheaval in their marriage. "Oh, come on, Jake," she said lazily. "Don't be so dramatic." Jake's breath hitched, her casual response making his head spin. He stared at her, then down at the lingerie dangling from his hand, his mind scrambling to make sense of her words. "Nothing. You've never worn this for me, Rachel." And this he tossed the rubber onto the bed forcefully, his eyes narrowing as his anger rose. "Do you think I'm an idiot?" Rachel calmly clicked the lipstick shut, dropping it into her purse. "It's for work," she said, finally facing him, her expression cool and unbothered. "I'm going to a business conference. You know how important presentation is in my field. We've talked about this." Jake's chest tightened, his fists clenching. "A business conference? With lingerie and rubber? Do you take me for a fool?" Rachel, his eyes bored into hers, demanding an explanation. "If you take one step out of this house, I swear I'll break your legs." Rachel's face twisted into a smirk as she stepped closer, her perfume overwhelming him. "Jesus, Jake, stop overreacting," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. She brushed past him, her scent lingering like a cruel reminder of their crumbling relationship. "It's just work stuff." Jake's head pounded, her calmness in the face of his fury was infuriating. Suddenly, her phone buzzed on the dresser, and the message on the screen caught his eye. "Mr. Big Johnson, can't wait to see you tonight." His heart dropped and his blood boiled simultaneously. Without thinking, he snatched the phone and held it up. "Who the hell is Mr. Big Johnson, Rachel?" he demanded, his voice cracking with fury, holding the phone inches from her face. Rachel barely glanced at the screen, crossing her arms and leaning against the doorframe, amusement in her eyes. "Oh, please," she scoffed, mocking him. "You wouldn't be able to handle the truth even if I told you. Don't try to control me, Jake. I'm an independent woman. I can do whatever I want." Jake's pulse throbbed in his ears. Every word from her felt like a knife twisting deeper. She stood there, indifferent to the wreckage she was causing, as if she believed she was beyond judgment. Her arrogance fueled his anger, but it was her next words that pushed him over the edge. "By the way," Rachel said, a smug smile spreading across her lips, "my lover's already waiting for me outside." Jake's jaw clenched, his hands balled into fists at his sides. He could feel his heart breaking, but there was no room for sadness, only anger and revenge. He took a deliberate step toward her, eyes locked on hers. "You think you can just walk out of here," he growled, his voice low and threatening, "and do whatever you want? You think there are no consequences?" Rachel shrugged, unfazed by his outburst. "Watch me," she said flatly, grabbing her suitcase from the bed and heading toward the door. Just as her hand reached for the handle, Jake lunged, grabbing her arm and yanking her back forcefully. The suitcase fell from her grip, and she stumbled, her eyes wide with surprise. "Not so fast," he snarled, his grip tightening on her arm. Rachel jerked her arm free, stepping back with a glare. "What the hell, Jake?" she snapped, her voice rising, irritation flashing across her face. "Let go of me. You can't stop me from leaving." Jake stood there, his chest heaving as the reality of the situation settled in. His mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, struggling to grasp the enormity of her betrayal, but all he could feel was a burning, cold rage building inside him. The woman standing before him was not the one he had married. That person was gone. All that was left was someone who had destroyed their life without a second thought. A dark idea suddenly took shape in his mind. Rachel thought she could walk out of his life without facing the consequences. She believed she could flaunt her betrayal and escape unscathed, but she was mistaken. She was about to face a consequence she could never imagine. He let go of her arm, his grip loosening as he stepped back, a strange calm settling over him that hid the storm raging inside. "Go ahead, Rachel," he said softly, almost too softly, a twisted smile spreading across his face that didn't reach his eyes. "Do whatever you want. Just remember, you started this." Rachel narrowed her eyes, clearly unsettled by his sudden change in demeanor. She picked up her suitcase, hesitated briefly, then opened the door. Without another word, she stepped outside, her heels clicking against the pavement as she walked toward the car waiting at the curb. Jake watched her leave, his chest tight with a mix of anger and cold determination. As soon as the door clicked shut behind Rachel, Jake stood frozen in place, the sound of her heels on the pavement echoing in his mind, each step a reminder of her betrayal. His hands trembled, fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to scream, to smash something, but he forced himself to stay still, his mind swirling in a storm of emotions. Jake sank into one of the kitchen chairs, staring blankly at the wall, the same wall she had just walked out past, acting as if her lies meant nothing. The indifference in her eyes cut deeper than any words. She thought she could walk all over him, but she was wrong. She wasn't going to get away with this. Jake grabbed his phone, his mind now consumed with a single focus: revenge. He needed a plan, something foolproof that would expose her for who she really was. No more begging, no more rage. He would strike her where it hurt most. He dialed a number and held the phone to his ear, listening to it ring. After a few moments, a familiar voice answered on the other end. "Mark, it's Jake," he said, his voice steady but cold. "Jake, it's been a while, man. What's up?" Mark's voice was casual, but Jake wasn't interested in small talk. "I need a favor," a big one. Jake leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, trying to keep his thoughts clear. There was a brief pause. Mark could sense the tension in Jake's voice. "You sound off. What's going on?" Jake closed his eyes for a moment, his grip on the phone tightening. "Rachel's cheating on me," he said bluntly. "I need proof." Another pause followed, this one longer. "Damn," Mark finally said, his tone shifting. "I'm sorry, man. That's rough. What do you need?" "Everything," Jake replied without hesitation. "Phone records, text messages, emails, whatever you can find. I want to know where she's been meeting this guy, how long it's been going on. I want to destroy them both." Jake let out a slow breath. "Jake, you sure about this? Once you go down this path, it's... I'm sure," Jake interrupted. "She started this. I'm just going to finish it." There was a brief silence before Mark responded, his voice more serious. "All right, I'll help you out. It'll take me a few days to dig everything up, but I'll get you what you need." Jake nodded to himself. "Thanks, Mark. I owe you." "Don't mention it. Just be careful, Jake. This kind of thing can get ugly." Jake hung up without replying, already focused on his next move. He needed to think beyond just getting evidence. He needed to humiliate Rachel the way she had humiliated him. But it couldn't be some spur-of-the-moment outburst. It had to be public, something she couldn't just walk away from. He paced the room, his mind racing through the details. Rachel had an upcoming company gala in a week, and he knew she would be attending with her lover, Greg. This was the perfect opportunity, but confronting her there wouldn't be enough. He needed something more dramatic. Jake sat back down and scrolled through his contacts. There was one person who could help him take this to the next level, an old college friend who worked in media production. If he could get video evidence of the affair, he could arrange a little surprise at the gala. Rachel's carefully crafted image would collapse in front of all her colleagues. Jake dialed another number this time. It was Eric, the media guy. "Jake, haven't heard from you in ages, man. What's going on?" Eric's voice was as upbeat as ever. "Eric, I need a favor," Jake said, his voice calm. "I've got a situation, and I need your expertise." "Sure, man. What do you need?" Jake didn't waste time with explanations. "I need help setting up a live stream for an event. It has to be discreet, but big enough for the whole room to see, and no one can know it's happening until it does." Eric was silent for a moment, clearly surprised. "You mean like a surprise broadcast? What's this for?" "It's personal," Jake replied, "but I'm willing to pay whatever it costs." Eric let out a low whistle. "You're serious about this?" "Okay, I can help. What kind of event are we talking about?" Jake leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing as he considered the logistics. "It's a corporate gala. I want to set up a live feed to project on the big screen at just the right moment." "And what's going on in this live feed?" Eric asked cautiously. "I'll get you the footage. I just need you to make sure it plays at the right time." Eric hesitated. "Jake, this sounds like something that could backfire. Are you sure this is how you want to handle it?" Jake's voice turned hard. "She's been cheating on me. I'm not going to stand by and let her get away with it. I want her exposed in front of everyone she cares about." Eric sighed. "All right, man, I'll do it. But you'd better be certain this is what you want. There's no turning back once it's done." "I'm sure," Jake replied. After hanging up, Jake felt a cold satisfaction settle over him. The pieces were falling into place. Mark would get the proof, and Eric would make sure everyone saw it, All he had to do was wait. Jake glanced at the clock. It was late, but he couldn't sleep. He went to the fridge, grabbed a beer, and sat at the table, staring at the wall as he replayed the day's events. He had once loved Rachel, but that love was gone. All that remained was the desire to make her pay for what she had done. He imagined the look on her face when the footage played on the big screen at the gala, her smug smile replaced by shock and panic. She had underestimated him, and she was about to learn just how wrong she had been. As the hours passed, Jake's resolve only grew stronger. He was ready to burn it all down. Over the next few days, Jake worked with quiet intensity, putting his plan into action. The sense of betrayal that had once overwhelmed him had now solidified into cold determination. He wasn't just going to expose Rachel, he was going to ensure she could never recover from this. Jake sat in front of his laptop, staring at the screen as messages from Rachel's phone came through. Mark had come through, using his tech skills to hack into her phone. Now Jake could see everything, every text, every call, every conversation she had with Greg. They had been meeting for months, sneaking around during work hours, exchanging flirty texts late into the night. "Rachel, I can't wait for the gala. It's going to be our night. Greg, I'll make sure we sneak away for a little private celebration." Jake clenched his jaw, disgust rising in his chest. He had once trusted this woman and built a life with her, and now she was planning to sneak around with her lover at a company event. But this was exactly the chance he needed. He leaned back in his chair, the plan taking shape in his mind. The company gala was the perfect stage. Rachel and Greg would both be there, dressed up, laughing, and pretending to be the perfect professionals, but Jake had a different plan. He was going to ensure neither of them left with their reputations intact. Jake picked up his phone and called Eric, the media guy. The plan needed to be perfect, and Eric was the key to making it happen. "Eric, we need to go over the setup," Jake said, as soon as Eric answered. "Yeah, I've been thinking about it," Eric replied. "You want the footage to play at the exact moment, right? I'll need access to the venue ahead of time to set up the live stream." "I can arrange that," Jake said. "I'll send you the address. Make sure it's discreet, no one can know what's happening until it's too late." "No problem," Eric assured him. "Just send me the footage when you're ready, and I'll handle the rest." Jake hung up and stared at the messages on his laptop again. He needed the perfect clip to play at the gala, something that would leave no doubt about what Rachel and Greg had been doing behind his back. He scrolled through her texts and then decided to look through her recent photos. As he clicked through the gallery, his stomach churned. There were pictures of Rachel and Greg looking cozy in hotel rooms, smiling as if they didn't have a care in the world. One video in particular caught his eye. It was taken in a hotel room, the camera facing the bed where Rachel and Greg were lounging, completely unaware that Rachel's phone had been recording. They talked and laughed, oblivious to the fact that they were being filmed. Jake's lips curled into a grim smile. This was exactly what he needed. He downloaded the video and sent it to Eric with a simple message: "This is the clip. Make sure it plays at the gala." With that done, Jake turned his attention to the guest list. He knew Rachel's colleagues would be at the gala, and he wanted to make sure as many people as possible witnessed the moment. He made a few anonymous calls, pretending to be a representative from the event's organizing team. "We've got a special presentation planned for the gala," Jake said, his voice calm and professional. "It's something that'll really get people talking, so make sure you don't miss it." By the time he finished, word had spread, and colleagues and friends were buzzing about the presentation, eager to see what could be so special. Jake knew they wouldn't be disappointed. As the day of the gala approached, Jake could feel the tension building inside him. He watched Rachel preparing for the event as if nothing was wrong, as if she wasn't about to be exposed as the liar she was. She tried on dresses, asking him which one looked best. He played along, keeping his face neutral and giving her no reason to suspect anything. "How about this one?" Rachel asked, holding up a sleek black gown. She smiled at him, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "I think this one's perfect for tonight." Jake looked at her, keeping his expression even. "Yeah, looks great," he said simply, swallowing the bile rising in his throat. The sight of her now made his skin crawl, but he couldn't show it, not yet. As the night of the gala finally arrived, Jake was calm, his plan fully in motion. He dressed in a sharp suit, playing the role of the supportive husband, even as he knew what was about to happen. Rachel was radiant, all smiles as they drove to the event, unaware that her life was about to be flipped upside down. They arrived at the venue, a grand hotel ballroom filled with corporate executives and employees. Rachel was greeted by her colleagues, who complimented her on her dress and makeup. Jake stayed back, watching from a distance as she mingled. He spotted Greg across the room, already heading toward Rachel with a sly grin. Jake's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Eric. "We're all set, just waiting for your signal." His fingers hovered over his phone, ready to send the signal that would trigger the video, but Jake waited, savoring the moment. He wanted to time it perfectly, just when Rachel thought she had won, just when she felt the most comfortable. He walked closer, joining the group casually, smiling as if nothing were wrong. "Having fun?" Jake asked, his tone light. Rachel smiled up at him. "Of course. This night is perfect, don't you think?" Jake smiled back, his heart racing in his chest. It's about to get a lot more interesting. With that, he stepped away, pulled out his phone, and sent the signal. Jake didn't approach her immediately. He needed to let her get comfortable, mingle with Greg, and feel at ease before making his move. After about an hour, Jake dressed in his own sharp suit and headed to the venue. The grand ballroom was packed with corporate elites, the air buzzing with conversation and the clinking of champagne glasses. Jake slipped into the crowd, nodding politely at familiar faces, but keeping his distance. He had no interest in small talk tonight. His eyes scanned the room until they found Rachel. She was standing with Greg near the open bar, laughing at something he had just whispered in her ear. Greg placed his hand on the small of Rachel's back as they toasted with champagne, sharing sly, intimate glances that made Jake's blood boil. She looked radiant, glowing under the dim lights, her polished exterior fooling everyone around her. But Jake knew better. Behind that facade of professionalism and charm was a woman who had shattered his trust, and tonight everyone would see it. Jake moved through the room quietly, slipping into a corner where he had a clear view of both Rachel and the stage. He watched as Rachel giggled at something Greg said, touching his arm lightly, and it took all of Jake's self-control not to confront them on the spot. But he knew that patience was key. The event had to build to its peak, and when the time was right, he would strike. The speeches began, and the crowd slowly gathered toward the front of the room. Rachel and Greg moved with the flow, completely unaware of the attention that would soon be on them. Jake blended in, keeping his expression neutral, waiting for the moment. As the evening reached its climax, the lights in the ballroom dimmed, and a large screen behind the stage flickered to life. Jake saw Rachel look up, expecting another routine corporate presentation. She stood close to Greg, the two of them oblivious to what was about to unfold. The room quieted, the murmur of conversation dying down as people turned their attention to the screen. The first thing that appeared was a series of text messages, their content illuminated in stark white on a black background. The crowd squinted, reading the words aloud in hushed tones, unsure of what they were seeing. Rachel's face remained composed at first, but as the words became clearer, her smile faltered. The messages were personal, intimate conversations between her and Greg that exposed the depth of their affair. Explicit language filled the screen, messages filled with desire and plans for secret rendezvous. Gasps rippled through the audience, heads turning toward Rachel, then to Greg and back at the screen. Rachel's face paled, her mouth falling slightly open as the realization hit her like a freight train. What she whispered, her voice barely audible. But it didn't stop there. The messages on the screen grew more intense, becoming increasingly explicit, leaving no doubt about what had been happening between Rachel and Greg. The room was filled with a stunned silence, broken only by the soft murmurs of disbelief from the crowd. Then the real horror began. Grainy footage replaced the text messages, a hidden camera video from a dimly lit hotel room, clear enough to show Rachel and Greg in the throes of passion. The sounds from the video echoed through the room, making the shock even more palpable. Rachel's face drained of all color, her hands flying to her mouth. She slowly turned toward Jake, who was standing across the room, his eyes fixed on hers. "What? What have you done?" she stammered, her voice shaking. Panic filled her eyes as she instinctively stepped back, bumping into Greg, who stood frozen beside her. Jake's face was devoid of any expression as he walked forward slowly, calm and composed, while the footage continued to play behind him. The eyes of everyone in the room followed him, their collective gaze filled with a mix of disbelief and discomfort. Rachel's colleagues stood in stunned silence, unsure of how to respond to the scandal unfolding before them. Jake reached Rachel, his expression unwavering. "You brought this on yourself, Rachel," he said, his voice firm but quiet enough that only she and Greg could hear. "You thought you could humiliate me, lie to me, and walk away. You thought I wouldn't find out." Rachel shook her head, her eyes wide with desperation. I can explain, Jake, please," she began, but Jake cut her off with a sharp gesture. "There's nothing to explain," he said coldly. "You made your choice, and now everyone knows the truth." Greg, who had been standing silently beside Rachel, finally found his voice. "Jake, man, this isn't what it looks like. It's not." Jake turned to him, his eyes narrowing. "Shut up, Greg," he said simply. "You don't get to say anything." The room was still in chaos, people whispering among themselves, their eyes shifting between Jake, Rachel, and the screen. The footage had stopped by now, but the damage was already done. The once glamorous event had turned into a spectacle of shame, and there was no coming back from it. Rachel, her hands trembling, turned back to Jake, her eyes pleading. "Jake, please, we can talk about this. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you." Jake looked at her for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "You hurt me the moment you decided to betray me. This is just me returning the favor." The aftermath of the gala was nothing short of explosive. The moment the footage stopped playing, the room buzzed with whispers and shocked glances. People exchanged looks, unsure of how to respond to the scandal they had just witnessed. Rachel stood frozen, still processing the public humiliation, while Greg slunk into the shadows, trying to disappear. Jake, however, remained calm, his face betraying no emotion as he walked out of the ballroom. His phone buzzed with messages, but he ignored them. All that mattered was the chaos he had set in motion, and now he just had to watch it unfold. The next morning, the fallout began in earnest. Rachel's phone wouldn't stop buzzing calls, messages, notifications. Her co-workers, friends, and even family were trying to reach her, but every conversation started with the same shocked tone. "Is it true? What happened? How could you?" She sat at her kitchen table, staring blankly at her phone. The night before had been a blur, a horrifying sequence of events that left her reeling. The texts, the video, the horrified faces of her colleagues, it all played on a loop in her mind. But she had tried to talk to Jake after the event, but he had already left, disappearing into the night without a word. Rachel picked up her phone again and dialed Jake's number, her hand trembling as she hit the call button. It rang twice before going straight to voicemail. She tried again with the same result. Beep. "Jake, please, I need to talk to you. We have to fix this. Please call me back." She hung up and leaned back in her chair, her mind racing with regret. She had thought she could juggle both lives, the affair with Greg and her marriage, without any consequences. But now, everything had fallen apart. Her reputation was destroyed, and there was no undoing the damage. Meanwhile, Greg's downfall was swift and harsh. As soon as he arrived at the office the next day, he was summoned to the HR department. The head of HR didn't bother with formalities. "Greg, you know why you're here," she said, her voice cold. He sat down, trying to feign ignorance. "Look, that video, it's not what it looks like. It's exactly what it looks like." She cut him off. "You had an affair with a co-worker. Not only is that against company policy, but it was publicly displayed at a company event. There's no recovering from this." Greg stared at her, the reality of his situation sinking in. "But it was a mistake. You're done here, Greg," she said firmly. "You're fired. Clear out your desk." He tried to argue, but it was pointless. The damage was done. As he walked back to his office, he could feel the eyes of his co-workers on him, their whispers following him down the hallway. Some looked disgusted, others almost amused by the spectacle. By the time he reached his desk, his personal items were already being boxed up by security. Rachel's career wasn't far behind. The fallout from the gala quickly reached her superiors, and they weren't happy. The company couldn't afford to have its reputation tarnished by scandal, especially one so public. Rachel was called into a meeting with the executives, and although they didn't fire her on the spot, the message was clear: she had no future there. She would be quietly phased out, her role reduced until she had no choice but to resign. Sitting in her car after the meeting, Rachel finally allowed herself to break down. The sobs came uncontrollably, and for the first time since the gala, she realized just how much she had lost. Her marriage was over, her career was in shambles, and her affair with Greg had left her with nothing but regret. But through it all, Jake remained silent. He didn't respond to her calls or texts. He was done with her, and she knew it. every attempt to reach out to him was met with the same cold indifference. She tried going to his apartment, knocking on the door, and begging for a conversation, but Jake never answered. The only interaction she had was a text from Jake's lawyer informing her that divorce papers would be served soon. Jake, meanwhile, watched from the sidelines as Rachel's world crumbled. His sense of satisfaction was cold, not joyous, but it was enough. He had spent months feeling powerless, trapped in a marriage with someone who had lied to him repeatedly. But now, he was the one in control. He didn't need to yell or scream, he had already made his point, and it was hitting harder than any argument could. Mark called him a few days after the gala. "So, how are you holding up?" "I'm fine," Jake replied flatly. "It's done." Mark hesitated. "Look, man, I know it felt good in the moment, but are you sure that was the right way to handle it?" "I mean, that was brutal." Jake sighed. "She had it coming. She wanted to be free of me, fine, she got her wish. But now she's got nothing." Mark was silent for a moment. "Yeah, but don't let it eat you up, man. Revenge, it doesn't fix everything." Jake knew Mark was right in a way. The revenge had given him a moment of power, but now that the dust was settling, he didn't feel the satisfaction he thought he would. The marriage was over, but the anger hadn't completely gone away. It lingered, gnawing at him even as Rachel's life fell apart. Rachel, now living in a cramped apartment, spent her days searching for jobs and trying to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. But everywhere she turned, the whispers followed her. People knew about the affair. Her name had become synonymous with scandal, and no one was eager to hire someone with that kind of baggage. She thought about Jake constantly, wondering if there was any chance of forgiveness, but deep down, she knew there wasn't. The life she had known, the stability she had taken for granted, was gone forever. Jake, on the other hand, found an odd sense of peace as he walked away from the wreckage of their relationship. It wasn't a feeling of victory, it was more of a calm resignation. He had done what he needed to do. He had ensured that Rachel would never forget the consequences of her betrayal, and with that, he could finally begin to move on, leaving the chaos behind.